Roguelike. If you've been following video games in the past few years, it's quite likely that you've heard this term before, and it's also likely that you've played at least one of the games that are called such: Binding of Isaac, Spelunky, Dead Cells, so on. For me, these games have been very interesting, and so I have thought a lot about what exactly they are. This is what this video is here to answer. What should roguelikes be? Now, you may be saying that you, in your infinite viewer wisdom, know what this term means. It means a game that has permadeath and randomness. However, paradoxically, another infinitely wise viewer may say you are wrong, saying that that's roguelites. Another will say that that's action roguelikes, so which one is right? Well, I could tell you my opinion, which is objectively correct. However, before that, I want to go over how this whole mess started. So, it's 1980 and some college students decide they want to make a game. They take a 1977 game called Colossal Cave Adventure, which had permadeath, and shuffle the rooms around, creating, you guessed it, Rogue. While at first they spread the game around their university, with time they further developed it and were able to put it into an operating system, allowing people around the world to find this game. With that, a slow chain reaction began, as people played Rogue and then wanted to add or remake it. This is how games like Hack and Moria were born, but you probably don't know what they are. That's because with time, even these iterations had their own evolutions, as Hack had NetHack and Moria had Angband, which are more popular nowadays. Point is, as decades went by, these games played somewhat similarly, and, for this video, three main aspects of them were important. First is, of course, permadeath, as whenever you died in these games, you would be sent back to the start. Second is simultaneous turn-based movement, where the moment you did some action, everyone else would also do their action. Lastly, there's randomization, as levels and items would all be shuffled, forcing you to prepare for as many possible situations as you could. With all that, the term roguelike was created, meaning like rogue. For a while, there were no issues with this, other than the term having a name be tied to a singular game, but this niche community kept playing and making roguelikes. This is where we go to 2008 to talk about a rather important game, Spelunky. On the surface, this was just another game, but when you thought about it, it played similarly to roguelikes. You would start a run, go through randomly generated levels, and either win or lose. In that sense, it was actually the same as roguelikes, and since it had a broader appeal than them, it attracted a lot of people that didn't really know how to categorize Spelunky. So they saw roguelikes and decided, hey, let's just call this game the same thing. However, roguelike fans disagreed, because they saw that the game didn't have simultaneous turn-based movement, which was quite essential when trying to make a game that feels like Rogue, especially when it was replaced with a very different core gameplay loop of platforming. That's why they used a different name, Roguelite, which for now effectively meant a game that has some of the important elements from Rogue, but not all of them. So, now we had a split, and the question was whether Spelunky is or isn't a roguelike. People had different answers, but if it's just one game, then it wasn't a big deal. But then Binding of Isaac came out, then Rogue Legacy, then FTL, and slowly, these games grew more and more numerous, and the people who played them were more often the people that didn't care about roguelikes, and so they called these games roguelikes as well. As for people who played older roguelikes, from what I could find, they did try to keep that name for their games, which is why I'll still see people calling these new games roguelites today. But in general, they were a smaller group and they stopped caring after a while. And now we are at the present, where the majority of people use the term roguelike to describe games with permadeath and randomness, such as Binding of Isaac, Hades, and Dead Cells. However, by now I hope you can see why I do not agree with the statement. In my opinion, since their creation, roguelikes have always been the same thing, games that play like Rogue. And let me tell you, Dead Cells and Hades do not play like Rogue. That's why, for the rest of this video, I will call these new games roguelites, as they are games that are similar to roguelikes, but don't quite get there. Some will point out different interpretations, however, and it'd be rude of me to not address them. One of the more popular separations of roguelikes and roguelites is through the use of metaprogression, as in, roguelikes have no metaprogression and roguelites do. Metaprogression is the progress that you are allowed to keep in between runs. For example, there is a special currency you can collect during the run that you can then spend for permanent upgrades outside the run. On the surface, this makes sense, as metaprogression does change your approach to roguelites by making them less skill-based. There are many people who would prefer playing games without metaprogression, and there are those that would wish to play a more grindy game, making this distinction useful. The problem is that the line between these is very blurry, So let's go over some games and try to find a place at which we could draw the line between what is and isn't metaprogression. Let's start with a game that I don't think that many people will know, Moonlighter. This is both a roguelite and a commerce game, where you go into dungeons, pick up items, and then come out to sell them and buy upgrades. The reason I bring it up first is because it's so heavily focused on the commerce aspects that you could even say that that's a larger part of the game than the roguelite aspects. Put simply, the metaprogression part itself may be more important. Next up is Hades. In this game, similarly to the example I presented earlier, you earn currency that you can then spend for permanent upgrades. These upgrades are very direct, as you can increase your stats and even gain multiple lives for each run. This game certainly has metaprogression, but the focus is still on the runs themselves. If you wish to draw the line before this, then you would have to know which games are more focused on runs and which are more focused on metaprogression, which is very difficult to tell. Then there's Gungeon. In this game, you do not gain any direct power outside runs, but you do unlock different weapons and ways to play. However, whether these make your runs easier or not is hard to say, because there's nothing that makes you obviously stronger. If you draw the line before this, then you'd somehow have to be able to tell in which games you can gain direct power and in which games it's just more variety. For example, Binding of Isaac functions similarly, but it has a few direct power-ups in the form of starting items for characters. So, does it not fit here? Next is Spelunky, and by now you may be happy that we finally reached a game without metaprogression. However, we haven't, as Spelunky has tunnels. These do not impact the game, but if you unlock them, you can practice later areas more easily. Sure, you won't get the true ending with them, but they can still help. If you draw the line here, then you would have to differentiate between what is optional and what isn't. So, by now you're probably wondering why I still haven't brought up a game without any metaprogression. Put simply, it's because I only know of one. Muck. Yeah, I'm not joking. That's the only roguelike that I've ever played, excluding actual roguelikes. The two closest ones I know would be Noita, which has unlocks, and SNKRX, which has New Game Plus, making them have some sort of progression in between runs. Muck has none. Every run you start is started with the same parameters. Now, of course, there probably are some more roguelites without any form of metaprogression, but my point is that they are rare. If you were to draw the line here, then what function does this term even have? To conclude, differentiating games by metaprogression runs into the issue of perspective on what metaprogression should be, and at its simplest definition, that will make the term have little purpose. There are a few more interpretations though, so let's go over them. Steam has a particularly odd way of having tags. We have roguelike and roguelite, which I believe go back to the whole metaprogression idea, but then there's more specific ones. Traditional roguelike is easy to understand. This refers to the original games like Rogue, such as NetHack and Angband. Action roguelike is where it gets interesting as, from what I can understand, these games have the permadeath and randomness, but not the simultaneous turn-based movement. This may sound all well and good, but this tag doesn't really serve much of a purpose, other than separating itself from turn-based games. Then there's roguelike deck builder, which simply specifies a more specific version of roguelites such as Slay the Spire, and it doesn't have many issues, but it also doesn't serve much of a purpose. The last one is easily the worst though, Roguevania. By this point, I hope we all understand that there's an issue with the terms roguelike and roguelite. However, these are not all of the problematic definitions, and one of the most egregious ones is Metroidvania. Originally, this meant games that are like Metroid or Castlevania, but with time, games branched out more and more, and as the term tried to contain it all, it became far less useful. Do you see a pattern here? By now, this word is used in such ridiculous context that it's becoming very hard to define. However, I don't want to sit here for another 5 minutes talking about how people think Zelda games are Metroidvanias, and how a genre that should have games that are similar to Metroid or Castlevania are just exploration games where you get items. No, this paragraph is about Roguevanias, which is a tag that makes little to no sense, as roguelites, which are focused on moving forward, clash with Metroidvanias, which are focused on exploring and backtracking. The most notable example is Dead Cells, and I can obviously agree that it's a roguelite, but what about it makes it a Metroidvania? That you get items you use somewhere else? It plays absolutely nothing like Metroid or Castlevania, and it definitely shouldn't be considered as such. There is an actual example of a Roguevania though, which is a robot named Fight, because this game was structured like a randomly generated Metroidvania first, and then had runs added to be a roguelite. This makes both aspects shallow, as they clash in what they're good at, but hey, it fits the tag at least. Let's talk about one more interpretation, which I find the least problematic, though still not correct, calling roguelikes as traditional roguelikes and roguelites as roguelikes. This is pretty much fine, as even though I dislike calling games like Dead Cells, which play basically nothing like Rogue, as roguelikes, it would be a nice middle ground between my idea and reality. The issue is that the word roguelite becomes undefined. We could destroy it, but that would just raise more confusion. If we kept it as the whole metaprogression thing, it would also make it more confusing. So it would end up as a word that would keep being brought up by various people for various reasons. So, having gone through these, I hope you can now see why these two styles of definitions don't really work. This is why I choose to use this definition. Roguelikes are a subgenre of role-playing video games, characterized by level randomization, permanent death, and turn-based movement. In this case, roguelikes are now mostly clearly defined and have come back to what they used to mean originally. So, the $10 million question then is what exactly are roguelites? Well, I wasn't able to find a definition for them, or even an attempt at one, so I've come up with my own. Roguelites are PvE games where the main goal is to reach the end by doing attempts with impactful, randomly generated elements that bring you back to the start of that attempt upon losing. This definition, at least to me, is successfully able to mostly separate what are conventionally considered roguelites and what games are not, but it does have to take a few assumptions. Let's see what I mean by that. First, the main goal is to reach the end. The reason I use the word main here is because there are a lot of games that have a hardcore mode, which gives you permadeath. If the game has some amount of randomness, the question becomes whether the game is now a roguelite if you choose to play it in that way. In my opinion, no, unless hardcore mode is the intended way to play. Of course, you may be saying that having intent in definitions is quite risky, but in this case, designing games around permadeath is very different from designing games without it, forcing the developers to usually pick one side. For example, Diablo is designed to be played without permadeath, and most people play it like that. Therefore, even though you can play it in hardcore mode, it's not a roguelite, though you can call that mode a roguelite experience. Next, attempts with impactful randomly generated elements. This is, of course, subjective as to what the word impactful means, but if a game uses randomness so little that it does not meaningfully differentiate runs from each other, then it isn't a roguelite. Then there's Reach the End, which is important in order to separate roguelites from older arcade games that didn't have an ending. A core part of roguelites is that you always have some sort of goal to reach. You just take different paths to get there each time you try. That doesn't mean roguelites can't go on infinitely. They just need to have some sort of an ending where you can then play as much as you can after it. There's also bring you back to the start of that attempt upon losing, which is somewhat important to note as not all roguelites use death as the loss condition. For example, in Luck Be a Landlord, you lose by not being able to pay rent. The final section is that little word at the start, PvE. Let me first ask a question to you though. Is Fortnite a roguelite? I understand that this question seems absurd to you, but think about it. You go back to the start when you lose, there is meaningful randomness, and there's an end goal. Of course, I'm not actually saying it is a roguelite, but what would be the difference? It's tempting to say that multiplayer is the difference, but then that would cause a bit of an issue, as a decent amount of roguelites have co-op modes. So, are they not roguelites as well? Then you may say, alright, I get it, it's PvE. But this is where I have to come clean and say that I don't know if it should be. Why that is can be answered with the most difficult to categorize game in this video, Crawl. Crawl functions like this. The game is played by 4 players, bots or people, and the goal of each of them is to either kill the current human player if they are not one, or survive as the human for as long as possible. You may say that that means that the players are competing, and therefore it is not a roguelite, but it's structured like a roguelite. It has floors, rooms, random items, and an ending. And if you play with bots, then there are no issues. However, some choice has to be made, and this is where I have to draw the line based on intent. I believe Crawl was made to be a fun party game, as it functions similarly in core idea to games like Mario Party. Therefore, by saying that roguelites are PvE, we separate them from not only multiplayer games like Battle Royales, but also party games. Well, we are finally done with that section, which means that there is only one question left to answer. A question so important that I should have put it at the start of the video, but oh well. That question is, of course, how do we call roguelikes and roguelites? There are some games that first started out as X-likes, such as Doom-likes, which then turned into FPS games because calling so many games as games like Doom because you shooting them is, well, a really bad definition. Same here. I've already outlined the definition that I think is best, but it needs a good name to go with it. My suggestion? Random run games. It may seem a bit too simple, however, so is first-person shooter. It rolls off the tongue nicely, and you gain a lot of what you need to know about these games just from reading it. And so, finally, we are at the end. And yet I think there are still people who would disagree with me. Even with something as simple as, well, I don't care what you think, I'm gonna keep calling them how I want to. And you may be right. In fact, no, you are right. Because when it comes to definitions, their most important aspect isn't how accurate they are, it is how widely used they are. Let me give you an example I like to use for this. Say we are in a village, and every day, 10 out of 100 people are chosen to do a task. The task is as follows. Go to a specific house, take a piece of paper, and place it on a table. If you do, you gain points, but they mean absolutely nothing. The tricky part is that in this house, there are two tables. One that is next to the entrance, and one that's a few meters away, which gives twice as many points per paper. Alright, now that we're done with the rules, what do you think people will do? Well, that's simple. People will come in, place their paper on the first table, and leave. After all, the points are arbitrary, and they don't want to waste time on a pointless activity. However, say there's someone who cares about points, who wants to get as many points as he can. So he goes a few meters to the further table and picks up more points. However, when he looks at the total amount of points, he sees that it's less. That's because there's another rule. If everyone places their paper on the same table, all points are tripled. Even though the man just wanted more points, in the end, he only lost points. He tries to convince people to go to the second table and bring it closer to the entrance, but you need everyone for that, and not everyone cares for arbitrary points. I don't think it takes a genius to see the metaphor here, and yes, all I'm doing in this video is harming the definition that I want to improve. I know that nothing will change, even if this video had 1 million views, but in the end, I can't help but struggle, even if one day, probably even a few years from now, I'll stop caring and call these games roguelikes again. However, I do hope that after all this, you've learned something. Maybe you won't go to the second table, but you'll understand why people say not a roguelike sometimes. Either way, thanks for watching till the end. I'd love to hear why you think I'm a dum-dum in the comments.